It is the summer of 1793. The air is thick with heat and mosquitoes. Muddy paths cut through swampland. There are no grand buildings here, no monuments, no dome catching the light. Just trees, marsh, and a handful of workers hammering stakes into the ground. One of those workers looks up, sweat on his brow, and squints at the horizon. Somewhere out there, they are building a city from nothing. A capital for a country that has never existed before. A country that is barely 10 years old. And yet, they believed. They believed so completely that they laid the very first stone and called it the future. This is Washington, D.C. And this is the story of how a patch of swampland became the most powerful city on Earth. Let's go back to 1783. The American Revolution is over. The colonies have beaten the most powerful military on the planet. Everyone is celebrating. But there's a problem. A big one. The new United States of America has no permanent capital. The Continental Congress has been bouncing from city to city like a traveler with no home. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Lancaster, York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York City. It's embarrassing, honestly. You just told the whole world you're a serious country, but you can't even decide where to put your government. And it gets worse. In June of 1783, a mob of angry soldiers surrounds the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. These are Revolutionary War veterans who haven't been paid. They want their money. Congress is trapped inside. They ask Pennsylvania's governor for help. He says no. Congress has to sneak out the back door. The most powerful legislative body in America just fled from its own city, like it was running from a creditor. Right then and there, the Founding Fathers made a decision. The capital of the United States needed to be its own territory, controlled by no single state, beholden to no local government. They needed to build something entirely new. Here's where it gets interesting, because choosing the location of the capital wasn't just about geography, it was about power. The northern states wanted the capital in the north. New York and Philadelphia were already thriving commercial cities. It made sense. It was practical. But the southern states, they had a different view. They were terrified of being politically dominated by the north. If the capital was in New York, they'd always be on the losing side. Enter Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, two men who agreed on almost nothing. Hamilton had a plan. He wanted the federal government to take on all the debts the states had built up during the war. The northern states loved this. The southern states, not so much. So a deal was made over dinner in 1790. The details are still debated by historians, but the result is clear. Hamilton got his debt plan. Jefferson and Madison got the capital in the south, on the Potomac River, right on the border between Virginia and Maryland. Both sides walked away thinking they'd won. History would eventually decide who actually did. Congress gave President George Washington something extraordinary. They let him choose the exact location of the capital himself. He picked a spot he knew well, land along the Potomac River, not far from his own home at Mount Vernon. Some called it a coincidence. Others called it something else entirely. Washington called it strategic. The site covered about 100 square miles, carved from the states of Maryland and Virginia. It wasn't the most impressive land in America. Parts of it were genuinely swampy. The summers were brutal, humid, and suffocating. Winters were unpredictable. But Washington saw something others didn't. The Potomac River was a highway to the interior of the continent. This city would become a trading powerhouse, or so he hoped. To design it, Washington hired a French-American engineer named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a man of enormous talent and enormous ego, which, as we'll see, turned out to be a real problem. L'Enfant's vision was breathtaking. He didn't just design streets, he designed a statement. Wide, diagonal avenues cutting across a grid of streets, creating grand open spaces and dramatic view lines. A city that would look, from above, like nothing else in the world. He imagined a Capitol building sitting on a hill like a crown, a president's mansion to the west, and connecting them, a grand ceremonial boulevard, the street we now call Pennsylvania Avenue. L'Enfant called his plan a city for the ages. He wasn't entirely wrong. Here is something they don't always tell you in school. Building Washington, D.C. was a disaster. Not a metaphorical disaster, an actual grinding, chaotic, nearly failed disaster. L'Enfant was a genius, but he was impossible to work with. He refused to share his plans with the land commissioners. He tore down a house belonging to a well-connected landowner because it was in the way of one of his streets. When told to stop, he kept going anyway. In 1792, less than 2 years into the project, George Washington fired him. L'Enfant left without giving anyone a copy of his plans. He spent the rest of his life trying to get paid, convinced the country had stolen his legacy. He died nearly penniless in 1825, having never seen what his city became. A surveyor named Andrew Ellicott reconstructed the plans from memory. A remarkable man named Benjamin Banneker, a free black mathematician and astronomer, assisted with the surveys. Without them, the entire project might have collapsed. Let's slow down and talk about something important. Washington, D.C. was built, in large part, by enslaved people. Enslaved men and women cleared the land, burned trees, drained swamps, and laid the foundations of the most powerful buildings in the free world. They quarried and hauled the stone. They mixed the mortar. They worked in conditions that were brutal and unrelenting. The White House, the Capitol, these were their hands. This is not a footnote, it is the foundation, a contradiction built into the very ground of a city dedicated to the idea that all men are created equal. It would take nearly 2 more centuries for that contradiction to truly be confronted. By 1800, the federal government officially moved to Washington. President John Adams and his wife Abigail became the first residents of the president's house, which we now call the White House. Abigail famously hung the laundry in the East Room because the house wasn't finished. There was no grand ballroom, no working fireplaces. Congress wasn't much better off. Senators and representatives arrived and immediately started complaining. The streets were unpaved mud tracks. There were no decent boarding houses. It was cold in winter and sweltering in summer. Pigs roamed the streets. The so-called City of Magnificent Distances was mocked as a city of magnificent distances, between nothing and nothing. One senator called it a worthy of the uncivilized. But they stayed. And slowly, the city grew. Then came 1814, and everything changed. America was at war again, this time with Britain, in what history calls the War of 1812. And the British, still stinging from losing their colonies 40 years earlier, decided to make a point. In August of 1814, a British force marched on Washington. President James Madison fled. First Lady Dolly Madison famously stayed long enough to save a portrait of George Washington before escaping. The British entered the Capitol on August 24th. They set fire to the White House. They burned the Capitol building. They burned the Treasury and the War Department. The city was lit up against the night sky in flames. A story goes that a British officer sat down at the abandoned table in the White House and ate the meal that had been prepared for Madison's cabinet before mockingly toasting the health of his enemy. Then he burned the place down. By morning, the heart of the American government was in ashes. But here is the remarkable part. A fierce thunderstorm rolled in the following day, drenching the fires. And within a year, rebuilding had already begun. The Americans didn't move the Capitol. They didn't give up. They rebuilt, bigger and more determined than before. The burning of Washington didn't break the city. It forged it. As America grew through the 1800s, so did Washington. But the city was always a mirror of the country's deepest tensions. Slavery was legal in the District of Columbia until 1862. The city had a bustling slave trade. Men, women, and children were bought and sold within sight of the Capitol dome. Abolitionists called it a national shame. Defenders of slavery called it none of Congress's business. The Civil War arrived in 1861, and Washington transformed overnight. It was no longer just a political capital. It became a military headquarters, a hospital city, and a refuge. Thousands of freed enslaved people flooded into the city, seeking safety and a new beginning. By the end of the war, a significant community had established itself, giving Washington a character unlike any other American city. Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed at Ford's Theater in Washington in April of 1865, just days after the Confederacy's surrender. The city that had seen so much history had now witnessed its darkest single night. In 1871, Congress finally gave Washington its own government. a man named Alexander Roby Shepherd took over as the city's de facto leader and pushed through a massive modernization program. New roads were paved, sewers were installed, trees were planted along the avenues. The swampy image of the capital began to fade. The price was almost ruinous. Shepherd ran up enormous debts and was eventually forced out. But the city he left behind was genuinely livable for the first time. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw Washington grow into something grander. The Macmillan Plan of 1901 reimagined the National Mall as a sweeping green corridor connecting the capital to a new memorial to Lincoln. The Lincoln Memorial was completed in 1922, its massive white columns visible from miles away. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on those steps and delivered a speech that echoed across the world. The city had come a long way from the swamp, but the distance still left to travel was immense. Washington, D.C. has always been where America argues with itself. Suffragettes marched here in 1913 demanding the right to vote. Veterans marched here in 1932, demanding the bonus pay they were owed after World War I. Franklin Roosevelt shook the country from this city during the Great Depression, delivering his famous fireside chats. Pearl Harbor changed everything from this city. The moon landing was coordinated from this city, and through every crisis, every protest, every celebration, the city endured. The Pentagon was built across the river in Virginia in 1943, making Washington the command center of the most powerful military in human history. After World War II, the Cold War turned the city into a global chessboard. The CIA, the State Department, the National Security Council. Washington became the place where the fate of the world was quietly decided over conference tables. Here's something that surprises many people. Despite being the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. does not have voting representation in Congress. The people who live here pay federal taxes, serve in the military, and are subject to every law Congress passes. But they have no senators and only a non-voting delegate in the House. Washington, D.C. residents couldn't even vote for president until 1964, when the 23rd Amendment finally gave them that right. It is one of the great unresolved ironies of American democracy. The city that represents freedom to the world has less political power than any state in the Union. Walk through Washington today and you feel the weight of everything that happened here. The National Mall stretches out in every direction, lined with monuments and museums. The Smithsonian alone has 19 museums and galleries, all of them free. The Washington Monument, the tallest structure in the city, stands over 555 feet tall. By law, no building in Washington is allowed to be taller. The city has reinvented itself culturally too. Neighborhoods like Shaw, Columbia Heights, and H Street have become vibrant, diverse communities. Washington is home to one of the largest concentrations of African American cultural heritage in the country. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, opened in 2016, draws millions of visitors a year. Over 700,000 people now call D.C. home. Millions more come every year to walk these streets, to stand at the Lincoln Memorial, to look up at the Capitol Dome, and to feel something. Stand at the edge of the reflecting pool on a clear morning. The Washington Monument mirrors itself in the still water. Behind you, Abraham Lincoln sits in stone silence. Ahead of you, the Capitol rises against the sky. This is the city that almost wasn't. The city built on compromise and contradiction, built by enslaved hands and immigrant dreams, burned by enemies, and rebuilt by people who refused to stop believing in what it could be. It has never been a perfect city. The country it represents has never been perfect either, but both have kept trying, kept arguing, kept marching, kept rebuilding. From a swamp in Maryland and Virginia to the center of the world. That is Washington, D.C. And that story, it isn't finished yet. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of Washington, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this one. Let me know in the comments what city you want to see next. As always, we'll see you in the past.